The scent of freshly sawn pine, mingled with the faint, earthy aroma of damp soil, was usually a balm to Elias Thorne's soul. For 20 years, it had been the perfume of his sanctuary, the smell of dedication, of patience, of a craft honed with loving hands. His fence, a testament to that dedication, had been his pride. Each picket, meticulously carved with a subtle, undulating wave, had been a whisper of the nearby ocean. The posts, sturdy oak, had been weathered to a soft, silvery gray, their tops crowned with a simple, elegant finial. It wasn't just a fence, it was a boundary, a statement, a piece of his heart made tangible, separating his quiet haven from the encroaching, often boisterous world beyond, until Karen's son. The words themselves tasted like grit in his mouth. Karen. The name conjured an image of perpetually pursed lips, a voice that could curdle milk, and an almost pathological need to find fault in everything that wasn't directly under her control. And her son, young Tyler, a whirlwind of unchecked adolescent energy and a disturbing lack of respect for anything that didn't belong to him. Elias had been in his workshop, the late afternoon sun slanting through the dusty panes, illuminating the swirling motes of wood dust. He was sanding a new batch of cedar, the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper, a familiar lullaby. Then the sound, a sharp, splintering crack that ripped through the quiet like a gunshot. It was followed by a chorus of shouts, the high-pitched shrieks of Tyler and the indignant squawks of a flock of seagulls that regularly nested in the old oak at the edge of Elias's property. He'd dropped his sandpaper, his heart leaping into his throat. He'd hurried to the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the sill. What he saw, even from that distance, sent a cold wave of disbelief washing over him. Tyler, a lanky, awkward boy of about 15, was astride something that looked suspiciously like a homemade go-kart, a contraption of plywood and bicycle wheels. And this contraption was making a beeline for his fence. Elias had bolted from the workshop, his boots thudding on the gravel path. He'd yelled, his voice hoarse with alarm, "Tyler, stop, get off there!" But the boy, high on the thrill of his reckless pursuit, hadn't heard him, or perhaps had chosen not to. The go-kart, with a sickening crunch of wood and a shower of white splinters, had collided head-on with the middle section of Elias's fence. The impact was brutal. A whole section, at least 10 feet of it, had buckled, posts snapping like dry twigs, pickets shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The go-kart, its front end mangled, had spun out and come to rest in a heap of debris, Tyler tumbling off in a tangle of limbs. When Elias finally reached the wreckage, his hands trembling, Tyler was already scrambling to his feet, a sheepish yet defiant look on his face. "You little—" Elias had started, the words catching in his throat. He'd looked at the devastation, at the gaping hole where his beautiful fence had stood, and a profound sense of violation washed over him. It wasn't just wood and nails that had been broken. It was something more. It was the integrity of his space, the quiet dignity of his home, shattered by the careless abandon of a child and the implicit permission of his mother. Karen had arrived shortly after, summoned by a wailing Tyler. She'd swept onto the scene, her face a mask of outrage, her voice already rising. "What is going on here, Elias? Tyler said you attacked him." Elias had stared at her, speechless for a moment. "Attacked him?" He gestured, his hand shaking, towards the ruined fence. "Attacked him? He smashed my fence! Look at it, Karen! My fence!" Karen had followed his gaze, her eyes scanning the destruction with a critical, almost dismissive air. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it's just a fence! Tyler, are you hurt?" She'd turned back to Elias, her tone hardening. "He's a child, Elias. Boys will be boys. Accidents happen. And frankly, that fence was looking a bit dilapidated anyway." Dilapidated? Elias felt a hot flush creep up his neck. Dilapidated? It was weathered, yes, but it was strong, it was beautiful, and it was his. He'd spent countless hours carving those waves, each one a reflection of the sea he loved. He'd chosen the oak for its resilience, the pine for its delicate grain. It was a work of art, a labor of love. And Karen, with her casual insult, had just poured salt in the wound. It was not dilapidated, Elias had said, his voice dangerously low. It was crafted, and it was smashed by your son's recklessness. Karen had sniffed. Well, he's very sorry. Aren't you, Tyler? Tyler, still looking a bit dazed, mumbled, Yeah, sorry. See? Karen said, a triumphant glint in her eye. Now, I expect you to pay for the damages, Elias. I'm not made of money, and I won't have my son blamed for something that was, frankly, an accident. Perhaps you should invest in something a little more robust. She'd given the splintered wood a disdainful glance. Something that can withstand a bit of activity. Elias had watched her storm off, Tyler trailing behind her, a mixture of anger and something else, something cold and determined, settling in his chest. He'd looked at the wreckage again, the shards of pine scattered like fallen soldiers. He'd felt a primal urge to rebuild, to restore, but not just to its former glory. He'd felt an urge to make a statement that would echo, a statement that would be impossible to ignore, a statement that would ensure that Karen and her son would never again treat his property, his sanctuary, with such utter disregard. That night, sleep eluded Elias. He tossed and turned, the image of the shattered fence replaying in his mind. He saw Karen's dismissive smirk, her condescending tone. He heard her words, something more robust. The idea, initially a flicker, began to ignite. Robust. Yes, that was it. Not just robust, but formidable. Something that screamed permanence, something that demanded respect. He sat up in bed, the moonlight casting long shadows across his room. His mind, usually filled with the gentle curves of wood grain and the intricate patterns of carving, was now occupied by a different kind of material. Heavy, unyielding, industrial. Railroad ties. The thought was absurd, yet it took root, growing with an almost alarming speed. Railroad ties, used and weathered, imbued with the history of countless journeys, of journeys both literal and metaphorical. They were strong. They were imposing. They were, in a word, robust. And then another thought, audacious and perfectly suited to the burgeoning anger within him. If he was going to build a fence that demanded respect, a fence that would stand as a monument to his indignation, then it should bear the mark of its catalyst. Karen. Every post, her name. Carved deep, indelibly into the very foundation of his new boundary. The idea sent a shiver of grim satisfaction down his spine. It was a touch of the absurd, a whisper of the theatrical, and a bold, undeniable declaration. The next morning, Elias rose with a singular purpose. He bypassed his usual woodworking bench, the delicate chisels and planes suddenly feeling inadequate. He needed something heavier, something more primal. He found himself poring over old catalogs, his fingers tracing the thick, dark lines of salvaged railroad ties. He contacted salvage yards, his voice devoid of any of its usual gentle warmth, negotiating prices, arranging for delivery. He envisioned the sheer weight of them, the dark, rich wood, the faint scent of creosote. He also began sketching. Not the delicate flowing lines of his old fence, but bold, blocky letters. Karen. He experimented with different fonts, settling on a strong, unadorned sans serif, something that felt both ancient and modern. He imagined the process of carving, the deep gouges, the sheer effort required to imprint her name onto each sturdy post. It would be a physical manifestation of his enduring displeasure, a constant, unavoidable reminder. As the first truckload of weathered railroad ties rumbled into his driveway, a mountain of dark, imposing wood, Elias felt a surge of something akin to exhilaration. The scent of creosote, sharp and distinct, filled the air, a stark contrast to the gentle pine of his workshop. This was a different kind of craft, a different kind of statement. This was not about beauty, not about delicate artistry. This was about resilience. This was about permanence. And this was about making sure Karen and everyone else in their quiet little coastal town understood the gravity of her son's transgression and the unwavering resolve of the man whose sanctuary had been violated. The new fence would not just be a boundary, it would be a monument, a testament to a broken trust and a bold, unforgettable declaration. The scent of freshly sawn pine, once the perfume of his sanctuary, now felt like a mockery. Elias stood in his workshop, the morning sun slanting through the dusty panes, illuminating the ghosts of his former fence. Shards of beautifully carved picket, once a testament to his patience and skill, lay scattered like fallen soldiers. The sickening crunch of wood, the sharp splintering crack, the sounds replayed in his mind, a discordant symphony of destruction, and Karen's voice, that sharp, dismissive lilt, echoing with a casual disregard that tasted like grit in his mouth. Dilapidated, she'd called it, his fence, his sanctuary. His hands, usually steady as he coaxed delicate shapes from wood, trembled slightly as he reached for a discarded chisel. It felt too small, too delicate for the task ahead. The grief over his ruined fence was a dull ache, but the anger, the anger was a potent, burning fuel. It had settled deep in his gut, a cold, hard knot that demanded an outlet. He wasn't just rebuilding a fence, he was erecting a monument to violation, a monument to Karen's utter lack of respect. He'd been walking the perimeter of his property that morning, assessing the damage, when the idea had struck him. It wasn't a gentle whisper of inspiration, but a thunderclap of grim certainty. The old fence, with its intricate carvings and welcoming curves, had been a plea for harmony. This new one would be a declaration. A statement so forceful, so undeniable, that Karen would be forced to confront it every single day. Railroad ties. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not of fear, but of a potent, dark satisfaction. They were robust, unyielding, imbued with a history of heavy burdens and relentless journeys. They spoke of permanence, of a strength that resisted the elements and the wear of time. They were the antithesis of his delicate pine pickets, the perfect embodiment of his current disposition. And the scent, the sharp, distinct aroma of creosote, a smell that clung to the air and seeped into your very being. It was the smell of industry, of brute force, of something built to endure. It was the smell of his new resolve. He'd spent the better part of the day contacting salvage yards, his voice a low rumble over the phone, carefully avoiding the tremor of his excitement. He knew exactly what he wanted: sturdy, weathered ties, thick with the grime of countless miles. He'd negotiated prices, arranged for delivery, and even specified the dimensions he'd need them cut to. He envisioned them standing tall, a formidable barrier, each one a solid block of defiance. But the true stroke of genius, the detail that made his heart pound with a fierce, almost unholy glee, was the inscription. Each and every post, carved deep so there was no mistaking it. Karen. It wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be polite. It would be a constant, unavoidable reminder. Every time she stepped out her door, every time she glanced towards his property, her gaze would fall upon her name, etched into the very fabric of his new, unyielding boundary. It would be a brand, a mark of her son's destructive impulse and her own dismissive attitude. The delivery trucks rumbled up his driveway 2 days later, a jarring dissonance against the usual quiet hum of his neighborhood. The sheer bulk of the railroad ties, stacked high on the flatbed, was impressive. They exuded an aura of brute strength, a stark contrast to the airy elegance of his former fence. The earthy aroma of damp soil mingled with the sharp, pungent scent of creosote, a smell that promised permanence. And perhaps, Elias mused with a grim smile, a touch of lingering discomfort for his neighbor. He'd already marked out the new property line, his movements precise and deliberate. The old fence, what little remained visible, was a memory he was actively erasing. He supervised the unloading, his eyes scanning each tie, ensuring they met his exacting standards. They were heavy, dense, and bore the marks of their former lives: faded paint, the occasional gouge, the ingrained dirt that spoke of 1,000 journeys. Then came the real work: digging the post holes. This was a far cry from the delicate chiseling and planing he was accustomed to. This was a brutal, physical endeavor, a wrestling match with the earth. He dug deep, ensuring each hole was wide enough to anchor the massive ties securely. His muscles burned, his palms blistered, but with each shovelful of dirt, with each thud of the ties into their resting places, a sense of grim satisfaction grew. He worked with a focused intensity, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel and the dull thud of the ties the only sounds that mattered. The sun beat down, but he barely noticed. His mind was a landscape of dark purpose. He imagined Karen's face when she saw the finished product. He imagined the initial shock, then the inevitable indignation, followed by a grudging, perhaps even fearful, respect. This fence wouldn't be ignored. It couldn't be. The carving was the most crucial part. He'd chosen a deep, blocky font, one that conveyed an unshakable solidity. He'd spent hours practicing the technique on scrap wood, ensuring the cuts were deep and clean. Using a heavy-duty router, he began. The machine roared to life, its powerful motor a stark contrast to the gentle rasp of sandpaper he usually employed. He guided it with a steady hand, the sharp bite of the bit carving into the dense wood. Karen. The letters emerged, stark and unforgiving. He moved to the next tie, and then the next. Each repetition was a deliberate act of defiance. He didn't rush. He savored the process, the physical manifestation of his anger taking shape before his eyes. The scent of creosote intensified as the router shaved away layers of history, revealing the raw, dark heart of the wood. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across his yard, the first 5 posts were in place, each bearing its indelible mark. They stood sentinel, a stark, imposing line against the twilight. They were raw, rough-hewn, and utterly unyielding. They were a far cry from the delicate, welcoming fence that had once stood there. But they were strong. They were permanent. And they were a declaration. He stepped back, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with a grimy forearm. The air was thick with the smell of creosote and exertion. A profound sense of accomplishment, tinged with a dark, almost vengeful satisfaction, settled over him. He looked towards Karen's house, its windows already glowing with the warm light of domesticity. He imagined her looking out, her eyes inevitably drawn to the imposing new barrier. He knew she wouldn't like it. She wouldn't appreciate the craftsmanship. This was a different kind of craft, one born of necessity and righteous fury. She would complain about the aesthetics, the smell, the sheer overwhelming presence of it. But she wouldn't be able to ignore it. And that, Elias thought, as he surveyed his handiwork, was precisely the point. The fence was no longer just a boundary. It was a statement, a monument to a broken trust. And Karen's name, etched into every single post, was the undeniable, unerasable signature of his enduring displeasure. The quiet little coastal town might have witnessed the destruction of his delicate fence, but it was about to witness the erection of something far more formidable, something that would stand, unyielding, for years to come. And Karen would be reminded of it every single damn day. The scent of freshly sawn pine was a perfume Elias Thorne usually savored, the very essence of his sanctuary. It clung to his clothes, his workshop, his very being. But now, it was soured. It mingled with the acrid tang of creosote, a smell that spoke of industry, of weight, of something far more permanent and less yielding than the delicate grain he'd so carefully shaped. The splintered remnants of his hand-carved picket fence lay scattered like fallen soldiers at the base of the newly erected behemoths. Each railroad tie, salvaged from some forgotten track, felt like a fist slammed onto the earth. They were massive, scarred by time and weather, their dark, almost black surfaces exuding a stern, unwavering presence. Elias surveyed his handiwork, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. He'd worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by a righteous anger that had simmered since the sickening crunch of wood had ripped through the quiet afternoon. The old fence had been a testament to patience, to artistry, to a desire for beauty. It had been a boundary, yes, but one that invited the eye, that whispered of the craftsman's touch. This new barrier was different. This was a declaration. He ran a calloused hand over the rough, oil-slicked surface of the first tie, the one designated for the corner nearest Karen's property. The wood was dense, heavy, an entirely different beast from the gentle pine. He'd already roughed out the letters, the sharp metallic rasp of his chisel biting into the wood. Karen. Each letter was deep, gouged with a deliberate, almost brutal force. He wanted it to be undeniable, a permanent scar etched into the very fabric of his property, a constant reminder to his neighbor of the violation. He'd spent the better part of 2 days wrestling the ties into place. The sheer weight of them had tested his strength, his back protesting with every heave. He'd dug the holes deeper than usual, reinforcing them with gravel and concrete, ensuring that no whirlwind of unchecked adolescent energy, no matter how misguided, would ever again breach this line. The rhythmic rasp of his tools had been a constant counterpoint to the distant whisper of the ocean, a sound that had always soothed him, but now seemed to mock the storm brewing within. Karen, of course, had made her presence known. The moment she'd emerged from her house, her face a mask of indignant disbelief, Elias had known the true battle had begun. Her voice, a shrill instrument that could curdle milk, had sliced through the air. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, Elias?" she'd shrieked, hands on her hips, her eyes narrowed into slits. "You're ruining the neighborhood. This thing is an eyesore." Elias had simply continued his work, the steady rhythm of his hammer blows providing a counter-rhythm to her tirade. He'd heard it all before, the complaints about his wood shavings drifting onto her lawn, the veiled criticisms of his solitary lifestyle. But this time, it was different. This time, she'd crossed a line, and he was drawing a new one, a much thicker, much darker one. "This is my property, Karen," he'd finally said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to her hysterical pitch. He'd held up a railroad tie, its weight a tangible symbol of his resolve. "And this fence will stand, and every post will bear your name." Her face had contorted, a mixture of outrage and something akin to fear. "My name? You're insane! You can't do that." "Oh, I can," Elias had replied, a small, cold smile touching his lips. "And I will. It's a reminder, Karen, a reminder of what happened here, a reminder of your son's recklessness and your own lack of accountability." He'd watched her storm back into her house, slamming the door with a force that rattled his teeth. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was far from over. But he was ready. He'd always found solace in his craft, in the tangible creation of beauty. Now he was channeling that same dedication into something else entirely, something that would stand as a monument to his indignation. He picked up his heavy-duty router, the one he'd barely used before, its industrial hum a stark departure from the delicate whine of his smaller woodworking tools. He positioned it over the next tie, the rough-hewn surface waiting. He began to carve the second letter, the A. The router bit dug deep, spewing dark, oily dust. It was a messy, aggressive process, nothing like the smooth, almost meditative sanding and chiseling he was accustomed to. But it was effective. Each letter was a deep wound, a scar that would never fade. He worked his way down the line of posts, the sun beating down on his back, the scent of creosote growing stronger, more pervasive. The R was next, then the E, the N. He carved each one with the same deliberate force, infusing each stroke with the memory of the splintering wood, the shriek of Karen's voice, the sickening realization of violation. This wasn't just a fence, it was a testament. It was his response, carved in wood and oil, and a righteous fury. By late afternoon, the first post was complete, the name Karen etched into its surface with a permanence that felt almost biblical. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The letters stood out starkly against the dark wood, bold and unyielding. It looked formidable. It looked like it belonged here, a sentinel guarding his peace, a constant, unignorable reminder. He moved to the next post, the one closest to the street, where the damage had been most severe. The go-kart, he'd seen it afterwards, a garish red monstrosity discarded like a broken toy. Tyler, the boy himself, had been a whirlwind of reckless energy, a force of nature unleashed without a thought for consequence. And Karen, his mother, had been the enabler, the one who'd brushed it all aside with a wave of her hand. Elias began carving again. Karen. The process was becoming easier, more fluid, as if his hands had finally caught up with the grim determination in his heart. He imagined Karen's face when she saw this. He imagined the way her carefully constructed veneer of neighborly civility would shatter. He didn't relish her discomfort, not exactly, but he relished the idea of her finally understanding the weight of her son's actions and her own. He worked until dusk, the light fading, casting long shadows across his yard. He'd completed 3 posts by the time he called it a day. 3 stark declarations of Karen. The sheer scale of the project was daunting, but the thought of stopping now was even more so. He had a dozen more posts to go, each one destined to bear the same indelible mark. He went inside, the scent of creosote clinging to him like a second skin. He ate a simple meal, the taste of grit still lingering in his mouth from earlier that day, a physical manifestation of the sourness that had settled in his soul. He looked out the window towards Karen's house, the warm glow of her kitchen light a stark contrast to the imposing darkness of his new fence. He knew she was in there, stewing, fuming. Let her. This was his property, his sanctuary, and he would defend it with whatever means necessary. And if that meant carving her name into every single post of a fence built from the bones of industry, then so be it. The quiet had been shattered, and he was building something that would echo that disruption for years to come. The whisper of the ocean was still there, but now it was accompanied by the low, resonant hum of his own unyielding resolve. The scent of creosote, sharp and acrid, clung to Elias's clothes, his hands, the very air around him. It was a smell that spoke of industry, of raw power, of things meant to endure and withstand. It was a far cry from the gentle perfume of freshly sawn pine that usually filled his workshop, a scent that whispered of sunlight and the slow, deliberate growth of trees. This new aroma was a declaration, a brutish bellow against the soft murmur of his former sanctuary. He worked with a ferocity that surprised even himself. The railroad ties, salvaged from some forgotten stretch of track, were heavy, unforgiving things. Lifting them, positioning them, digging the deep, grudging holes for their bases. It was a physical exertion that demanded every ounce of his strength. But with each heaved tie, with each shovelful of dark, damp earth tamped firm around its base, a grim satisfaction settled deeper within him. This was not the delicate dance of chisel and plane, the patient coaxing of beauty from wood. This was brute force meeting brute force, a monument to his indignation. The chainsaws whined, a guttural roar that echoed across his property line, a sound that Elias imagined was already grating on Karen's nerves. He'd learned to work with them, to respect their power, but also to bend them to his will. The lettering, carved deep into the rough-hewn surface of each tie, was aggressive, almost violent. He wasn't carving, he was gouging. He wasn't lettering, he was branding. Karen. The letters were thick, uneven, each one a testament to the splintering resistance of the aged wood. He'd used a thick, blocky font, designed to be seen from a distance, designed to be unmissable. He'd spent hours sketching it out, refining it, ensuring it possessed the weight and permanence he desired. It wasn't just her name, it was an accusation, etched in indelible ink. He'd finished the first 3 posts by the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Each post stood sentinel, a dark, hulking sentinel against the fading light. He'd spaced them with a deliberate, imposing regularity, creating a barrier that felt less like a fence and more like a fortification. The old picket fence, with its delicate carvings and cheerful finials, now seemed like a fragile memory, a whispered apology for the robust declaration that was rapidly taking its place. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy, creosote-stained hand. The sheer scale of it was starting to dawn on him. This wasn't just a fence, it was a statement of epic proportions, and Karen's name, repeated with relentless uniformity, was the punchline, or perhaps the epitaph, to their neighborly acquaintance. He could already feel the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable tension that now permeated the once peaceful boundary between their properties. He imagined Karen peering through her blinds, her face a mask of disbelief and outrage. He imagined Tyler, perhaps, looking out with a mixture of fear and a grudging, adolescent awe. Good. Let them look. Let them understand the weight of their actions. The next morning, the air was cooler, crisper. The scent of the ocean, usually a gentle whisper, felt more like a bracing slap. Elias returned to his task, fueled by a potent mix of righteous anger and a strange, almost artistic satisfaction. He worked with a steady rhythm, the rasp of the saw, the dull thud of the mallet, the sharp splintering crack as he finished a letter. Each sound was a note in the symphony of his retribution. He'd acquired a small army of these ties, enough to stretch the entire length of his property line, and then some. He was building it to last, to become a permanent fixture, a stark, unyielding monument to the day his sanctuary was violated. He worked through the morning, the sun climbing higher, casting sharp shadows that danced with the dust motes kicked up by his labor. Around noon, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of Karen's voice, sharp and brittle, cutting through the quiet afternoon. He paused, his saw still in his hand, and turned towards the sound. There she was, standing at what used to be the edge of his property, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. "Elias Thorne, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" He lowered the saw slowly, deliberately. The creosote scent seemed to intensify, as if the very air around him was solidifying. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, "I'm building a fence, Karen," he said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil that still churned within him. "A fence? That's not a fence. That's an eyesore. It's hideous. What are those things?" She gestured wildly at the imposing railroad ties, her voice rising in pitch. "They're railroad ties," Elias replied, stating the obvious with a calm that he knew would only infuriate her further. "Strong, durable, meant to last." "Last? They look like they're about to fall over." "And what is this?" She pointed a trembling finger at the freshly carved letters on the nearest post. "Karen, you carved my name into those things?" A slow, grim smile touched Elias's lips. "Yes, Karen, I did. I thought it would be a fitting reminder. A reminder of how your son, with his reckless disregard, shattered something beautiful. A reminder of how you dismissed my property as dilapidated. A reminder that boundaries, once broken, need to be rebuilt. Not with flimsy apologies, but with something substantial. Something that demands respect." Her face contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You can't do this. This is harassment. I'll call the police." "Call whoever you like, Karen," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "This is my property, and this is my fence. A fence built to remember, a fence built to last, and on every single post, a little reminder for you." He turned back to his work, picking up his saw. The rhythmic whine started again, a defiant song against her sputtering rage. He could feel her eyes on his back, burning holes through him, but he didn't flinch. He was beyond caring what she thought. He was in the process of creation, albeit a dark and vengeful form of it. He worked through the rest of the day and the next. The fence grew, a dark, imposing line separating their worlds. The scent of creosote became a constant companion, a pungent perfume of his resolve. He saw Karen only a few times, always from a distance, her figure stiff with indignation. He noticed her avoiding eye contact, her usual confident stride replaced by a hurried, almost furtive approach to her own property. Tyler, he saw once, peeking out from behind a curtain, his face a mixture of apprehension and what Elias suspected was a flicker of grudging admiration for the sheer audacity of it all. The go-kart was gone, presumably locked away, a silent testament to its destructive power. With each completed post, Elias felt a sense of closure, a physical manifestation of his anger being channeled into something tangible. He was no longer just a craftsman. He was a builder of boundaries, a sculptor of consequence. The old fence, with its delicate beauty, was a thing of the past. This new fence, this brutal, unyielding barrier,